Hi, welcome to the Chamber of Spoilers. So today we're talking about the worst YA book that I have ever read. Now, let's talk about this. Now, we kind of do have to acknowledge that whenever you talk about YA in a negative light, people hate things that teenage girls like. They just do. Boy bands, sparkly stickers, Claire's, find something that teenage girls like, people will find a reason to hate it. Because for the most part, our culture is sexist. And we live in a world where anything women like is for women and nobody else is allowed to like it, and where things for teenage girls are supposed to be bad. They have to be bad, everybody hates it. And there is this kind of culture in the book world to think that YA is bad, but it's just not. YA is an age group like anybody else. It's not a genre, it is an audience. YA is usually intended for people between the ages of tween years to early 20s, but anybody can enjoy it. And saying
oh, if you're over 35 and you like YA, that's illegal.
Okay, Jan, I'm glad that your spicy take got you some attention. Did it fill the hole inside of you? Do you feel better now? Call your mom, Jan. Call your mom. So my thing about it is that whenever I'm criticizing YA, I want to make it about the relative merits of the work. So for example, I don't like Twilight. I enjoyed reading it at some point in my life, but looking back on it now and looking at it then from the perspective of just a human person, I was like, well, these are some troubling relationship dynamics. And this sure is some Christian stuff in here that I don't really relate to. And wow, this girl's boyfriend is really bad about respecting her boundaries and listening to her needs. So when I'm looking at YA, I'm trying to think, is this criticism internalized misogyny, or is it me thinking, oh, thing bad? So the book we're talking about today is Revolution by Jennifer Donnelly. I wouldn't say it's the worst book I've ever read, but it's definitely the worst popular YA book. Before I get too far into things, content warnings: suicidal ideation, mental illness, child death, sexual assault. What else? Anything else? It's pretty bad already. Content warning, drug abuse. Oh, content warning, self-harm. Okay, so the reason that I think this book is bad is because there's so much bad stuff in it. It's also somehow 3 books in a trench coat pretending to be one. So we'll get there. So let me give you the gist. So Andy is a teenage girl living in New York with her mom. Her parents recently split up following the tragic death of her young brother, who died in an accident that Andy blames herself for. So she's depressed, naturally, and fairly suicidal. The first couple chapters of the book are pretty disconnected from the rest because it's kind of sad Gossip Girl. Not that Gossip Girl isn't already pretty sad, but depressed Gossip Girl with a goth filter of sadness. She is clearly depressed, clearly having thoughts of suicide, self-harming. Andy and her mom are actually both in a pretty bad mental place. Andy is a musician and her mom is an artist, so they're very deep and not like other girls. And Andy's mom is basically dying. She is in a really bad mental place to the point that she stopped taking care of herself, she stopped taking care of Andy, she stopped being a mom. Which is pretty believable considering she's lost her son. Losing a child is the worst thing that any parent could imagine. So Andy's mom is understandably unwound, and Andy is basically just trucking along, trying to keep living the way that she has with nobody taking care of her. Now, as previously mentioned, her dad has left the family, and he has a new girlfriend. And he doesn't live in New York anymore. So Andy feels fairly abandoned by her dad and kind of resentful. So after these first couple chapters, Andy's dad comes to town, sees the situation that she's in with her mom, and is like, this is not gonna work. Your mom is going to an institution to get better, and you are coming with me to Paris for spring break. Now, obviously, Andy is deeply troubled due to what's been happening in her life, and her response to her dad is basically, fuck you, we don't need help, we're doing just fine. Of course, her mother is slowly killing herself, and Andy also wishes she were dead, but, they're fine. And so it's totally understandable at this point in the story that Andy be resentful and angry at her father and not happy about the situation being out of her control, because at this point in her story, her desire is to remain independent and autonomous, and she doesn't trust her father, and she misses her brother, and it's all just a big clusterfuck. So then, in the next part of the story, Andy goes to Paris with her dad, and she's staying with some family friends who are more like family, who basically get no characterization other than they're eccentric. And they're actually pretty fun to read about because everybody in this book sucks, so they're not too bad. Andy spends the next part of the book traipsing around France, not doing her homework, because she's basically failing out of school due to being incredibly depressed. She essentially has to pull her socks up or get kicked out And so her dad basically says, okay, well, we're here, you're gonna do this, and I'm gonna work, and it's gonna be fine, we're gonna sort it out. Andy, meanwhile, is angry and resentful at her father for a number of things, but also is angry and resentful that her mother's been institutionalized, despite the fact that she is literally dying of depression. Andy is still angry about that, which again, she's an adolescent. It's understandable at this point in the story. You're gonna keep noticing me saying at this point in the story, because at some point, we're gonna assume things get better. Nope, they just get crazier and worse. Bear with me. Andy finds a diary, which is basically like a several hundred-year-old diary of a girl named Alex, who lived in France around the time of the French Revolution and had a bunch of interactions with the royals. And this book kind of comes across as like vaguely royalist, at least sympathetic, and is kind of like understanding of the plight of the royals, which doesn't really come across well to me. Now we have split points of view. Andy in modern day Paris, depressed and dealing with her whole situation. And Alex in the past, just doing nonsensical things. And for the record, I'm not going to talk too much about Alex because she's a terrible character. She has almost no characterization. She is, generally speaking, a non-entity. She does things when the plot requires it of her. She has no character, and she's boring to read about, and reading through those sections was simply torture. And this is coming from someone who read all of the Royal Diaries books, cover to cover. I love historical fiction. I am always a slut for it. But it's really depressing when you can't make the French Revolution interesting. It really fucking is. Like, this is a pretty sad state of affairs. Andy's dad is doing a bunch of work and not really paying attention to his daughter. And like overall, like I agree with her assessment that he's a bad father. But at one point in the novel, she overhears him talking to his girlfriend who is expecting his baby, saying that Andy isn't connecting with him because she still blames him for her brother's death. Now, in her mind, Andy believed that her father blamed her for her brother's death, and she also blamed herself. And that's why he had abandoned her. So now, armed with this new information, she doesn't go, oh, this is something I can work with this. And that should have been a point in the story where it's like, let's develop this father's character a little more. And so she has this new information. She's like, well, I guess I won't do anything with that. I really hate this book so much. Part of the modern day storyline is Andy beginning a relationship with a taxi cab driver who is a 19-year-old musician. And he's not that much older than her, but I really don't like age gap relationships with teenagers because inevitably there is a power dynamic imbalance, and he is an adult in the workforce. And also, I just don't think that teenagers should have relationships with adults. Like, even 18 and 19, if 18 is in high school and 19 works at Burger King, is kind of suspect to me. I'm like, well, but you have a job. Why would you want to hang out with someone who has to wake up at 5 in the morning to go to swim practice, idiot? So this romantic subplot is completely unnecessary because Andy already has a lot going on, and the book doesn't really need it, and they don't have any chemistry. Like, I would also feel differently if this person made Andy feel grateful at all for her privileges, because she's a rich white girl, and he is not. But she doesn't like think about that at all. She's just one of the guys. She's down. She's not like other girls. God, I hate this so much. So Andy does a lot of research on this historical figure that she gets really fascinated with, Amade something, and he's like a musician, and there's not a lot known about his life. And so that's what she's doing with her time. Now, one part of the story we haven't touched on yet is that Andy is actually French through her mother. And so as this French city kid, she's just hanging out in Paris by herself in the dead of the night. Now, back in the Jurassic period, I too was an at-risk kid who was raised in the city, and j'ai pas français aussi, mais I would not have done this. I've done a lot of things in my life that might not have been advisable, but I never walked around a European city by myself in the middle of the night with almost no money and an 18th century journal. Yep, she's just walking around with an artifact, not taking care of it. Like, I'm a librarian, but I'm not an archivist. I don't have any training in historic preservation, but just common sense will dictate to you that you should not carry around something that old without protecting it. Hell, if you're not trained, you shouldn't be touching it at all, because that's a historical document. That has value and relevance, and a 17-year-old girl with no expertise who apparently sucks at school shouldn't be carrying it around. And like, you might think that I'm being pretty hard on Andy. Her brother is dead, her mother's in really bad shape, she's in pretty bad shape. Thing is, she never changes and she never experiences consequences for her behavior. She never gets into a place where she's in danger because she's acting recklessly and then has to think, oh, I'm going to change my mind. Or she never has this moment where she's frightened and thinks, oh, I should probably be more careful. Or, oh, maybe I shouldn't slack off so much. Or, oh, maybe I shouldn't take my sleeping pills on such a regular basis that I sometimes can't get out of bed and don't feel the need to eat. Andy does reckless, stupid, and consistently self-endangering things without thinking about how things are going to go, without thinking about the consequences, which is fairly teenagey. Like, don't get me wrong, I too was once a young person, as we previously said, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. The thing about that is, you're supposed to learn from that. You learn and you grow, and that's what coming of age is. Like, you can't have a book where a person does everything wrong and then at the end it goes right for them, and you guessed it, that's exactly what's going to happen. The historical fiction plot marches on. Andy continues to do reckless and dangerous things, and eventually she mysteriously goes back in time. Yes, she goes back in time, and she takes over Alex's life because Alex has died, and she has kind of looks enough like Alex, I guess, that she can kind of slide into her life. And she meets that musician that we talked about earlier very briefly, and like learns some historical facts about him that we're going to use later. And she's just like, oh, I've gathered some new information. I'm really good at analyzing that. So she basically hangs out in 18th century France for a little bit, completely disregards her own life, thinks about committing suicide some more, and then eventually she gets back. And her dad is happy to see her or whatever. And then at the end, she has written a thesis that is very successful about the musician she went back in time and saw. She like discovered something and then was able to find proof about it in the present day. And that is how she's become so successful that she's been accepted at the Sorbonne, and she is just doing great. She picked up her mom from the institution when she got back, and together they threw their medications out the window. Yes, they threw their medications out the window. And then they moved to France, and they're better. The geographical cure is one of my least favorite tropes, because no matter where you live, there you are. Like, if you move to the most beautiful island in the Mediterranean, you're still going to be depressed. Unless your problem is, God, living in Reno is so depressing because it's so ugly. I've never been to Reno. I'm sorry, Reno. Then maybe the geographical cure will fix you. But if you're depressed because your kid died, your kid's still going to be dead in France. I got bad news for you, bud. Death certificates follow you around the world. And she doesn't stop blaming herself for her brother's death. She never moves emotionally beyond this point. She just is successful now due to her time-traveling discoveries. Looking back on this book, while I was reading it, I was thinking, oh, this might not be for me. Because I like historical fiction, but I didn't like a lot of the things in this book that were about Alex, the historical character, just because I knew they weren't realistic. And there were a lot of times when the characterization was lacking and the writing wasn't very good. And I also really didn't like the trivialization of Andy's privilege, because, like, I too have been depressed. Congratulations. Like, do you want a medal? Like, I have a lot of sympathy for people with mental health problems because, hello, how are you? I also have mental health problems. But the solution isn't be a dick to everyone around you and harm yourself and others. Like, at a certain point when it comes to rich teenagers who could do anything they wanted, I lose sympathy a little bit. Like, it kind of makes me crazy that in all of this, Andy wasn't thinking like, oh, I could go to therapy. She lives in New York City. There are therapists there, I promise. Like, I really hate the throwing the medication out the window thing, because it portrays this narrative once again that, of course, mental health professionals are the devil and all you really need is some fresh air and to work out in your garden. I love my garden, but I also love my SSRIs and my benzos. They are the thing that help me function on a day-to-day basis. I've been on medication since I was 16 years old because it's really hard to exist in this world when your brain is your enemy. So I have really very little sympathy for somebody who has all kinds of resources at their disposal. Money, time, a parent who actually cares about them and wants to be involved in their life and to help them, and they're just like, you know what, I'm gonna throw my medication out the window and go to Paris. That'll fix me. Like, and I'm also thinking about somebody who isn't really at that place in their mental health journey. Like, I'm in a really good place. I've been in therapy for 10 years. This is not new to me. But if I'm thinking about a teenager who reads this book and is in therapy because they're depressed, what does this book say to them? Like, I'm not always the one who's like, oh, but the message here basically is, fuck doctors, they don't know anything. Fuck medicine, what you need is Paris. The book is also, like, really long. Like, really long. It's unfortunately long. I feel like this book is basically a first draft. Like, the main character has this saint-like devotion to her mother, where she believes, I suppose because her mother is the parent who stayed, that her mom did nothing wrong and doesn't need any help, and all she needs is to be home in Paris and to be able to paint. And like, okay, I mean, thing is, her dad is kind of one of the villains in the book because he wants to move on with his life. He's found a new partner and he's still working, and like, he's maybe not a good guy or a good dad, but at least he's not drowning in his sadness and like glorifying his depression. Like, this book has kind of very I am very deep sad depression vibes, like kind of like that Tumblr girl aesthetic of like, look at my beautiful cutting scars, really nasty stuff. And I think that it's not great in terms of like representation of mental illness. I don't think everything has to be representation, but if one of the main themes of your book is going to be mental illness, and you're going to end your book with being like, and we threw our medications out the window, maybe you should cut that plot point for your main character. Or maybe you should think about, is this going to be harmful to my readers? Like, it's so crazy to me because I know how books come to be. I know how they're published. This has gone through multiple drafts and lots of editing. And so they got to the end of that and put the book to print with the father's character having no arc and being completely flat, and the daughter starting out a stuck-up prick and ending a stuck-up prick but successful, and with all of this garbage mental health messaging. Like, I don't necessarily think the author is a bad writer, and if this is your favorite book, I don't want to yuck your yum. It's just like, looking at it as an adult and reading it from this perspective, it's like, oh wow, you have posted cringe. And maybe it is a relic of the time in which it was published. When did this book come out? This book came out 10 years ago in 2011, so maybe it is a relic of the time that it got published, but even back then, I think it's pretty unacceptable to have this kind of mental health messaging in a book intended for teenagers. I'd say overall, one of my biggest problems with this book is it's being overstuffed. Like, it could have been a book about grief, and it could have been a book about family, and it could have been a book about the French Revolution, or a book about historical preservation, or about high school kids with too much money and doing drugs, but like, it had to be all of those things, and it didn't work. I think what this book either really needed was a hacksaw or a better editor, and, you know, maybe she's written other things that are better, but it's just really bad. I hated it. And I will say that, like, the title might seem like an exaggeration, but I've been reading YA for close to 15 years, and this is definitely the worst YA book I've ever read. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.